to listen to Eva Pfannes for it. And as I mentioned, we wanted to do all the session at EPFL also because it was important as a collective platform in the faculty and ACT, also to have a possibility of discussion about the topics on ecological change and territorial design. But now we are facing the actuality, and we are happy to do so remotely. Maybe we can have more people connected. And no, it's really nice to finish this cycle with a more practical aspect, maybe after many contribution from different fields, but mainly theoretical. So probably from the front line will be a nice way to finish this these 6 sessions at EPFL. Paola, I let you introduce.
Okay, thanks, Valentin, and welcome, Eva. And very happy to have you tonight. Of course, as Valentin was saying, we were hoping to make of these moments also moments of higher degree of sociality, but we are really at the minimum with this Zoom system. But in any case, we had a nice season, quite strong, and I think you were also present in one of the presentation with Erika Zwingedo, I think, and maybe Grit also.
Yeah.
So the idea is really to challenge a little bit this idea of a transition, ecological transition, knowing that. It's a kind of inevitable type of reflection, but at the same time also we cannot just take it as granted as something that is non-problematic. So the attempt is also to deconstruct a little bit the difficulties or the ambiguities that are inside this notion of ecological transition. So Eva is an architect and an urban designer. She's based in Rotterdam and working in different parts of the world, including also India and Brazil. She is a co-founder of the design practice OOSE or OOSE. I don't know if OOSE. Okay, with Sylvain Hartenberg in 2003. And they work on different type of projects, different scales, from regional research and design to architecture, combining a quite elaborate understanding of natural ecological processes with technological expertise and deep insights into the socio-cultural behavior of users of the built environment. They work on the same metabolic approach also, and they are very, very attentive, very keen to human scale and comprehensive urban strategies. I will not read all the bio. Maybe we have just to remember that Eva was co-curator of the last edition of the International Architecture Biennial in Rotterdam. And that their work has been published widely. And maybe also this interesting point is that you are working on a local energy action plan to decarbonize neighborhoods. And also you are the team lead for the City of 1,000 Tanks project in Chennai, in Thailand. That is part of the Water as a Leverage program of the Dutch government. So you are in fact working on very important issues, water, climate change, resilience strategies, etc. And that's why we are interested to listening to you. Thank you very much. And now it's up to you.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you so much for this nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation in this lecture series. I will give today some examples of the work, and I will also try to make the link to kind of the aspects that some lecturers before me had discussed. perhaps in a different way. And so for us, the agency aspect is very important, the agency for change and how we can actually feed that from both sides, from the theory and from the practice angle. Why do we need to transition? What is the status quo? We have a destabilized environment and a destabilized society. We have many problems. We have too much water. This is just an example from the summer. We have too much water in Turkey, in Belgium, in Switzerland. We have, it's too hot. We have the permafrost, and all this, of course, brings about the destabilization also of society. We have youth, we have Black Lives Matter protest, and we see how the extractive culture that we have links actually the ecological and the social aspect in a very strong way. On the other hand, it's not exactly something new. The climate change effect and how our way of using energy, how our way of burning extensively all sorts of fossil fuels has an effect on the climate is known since a very long time. To be precise, we can see here some newspaper extracts from 1912, so that's more than even 100 years ago. On the other hand, we can also see that the technical solution to generate energy in other ways than by burning are also more than 100 years old already. So our conclusion, and also from experience how we work, is in fact that the technical aspect is not the problem. Technically, it is possible to solve the situation we are in. But the question is, are we as the profession, as architects, are we being asked the right questions? And are we being given the right commissions? Now, we can say we're not, and we can say simply, okay, we can do nothing because we're not asked the right thing. We continue to build iconic architecture, and we're continuing to build airports if we asked to do so. But we could also think, what is the tool we have, and what is the architect's tool, which is the built environment, which is space, which is experience. To come back to that quote of Edmund Husserl from the beginning, it is really in the experience that the experiment starts. And we see architecture in our practice at OOS, we see architecture as a tool for different things. We see it as a tool to understand and to research. So each project is really an exploration. It starts with an exploration. It's really a hands-on research that is then shared. And that is the second aspect that's very important, is to educate, to see projects also as a way to communicate an issue in a way that is not simply on paper, but that is built, that you can touch, that you can smell, and that you can discuss. And those two together lead then to the third aspect, which is to enable the imagination of alternative futures. Then once something is built in a community, people get together and see possibilities that otherwise they wouldn't have known or they wouldn't have seen. It's a bit like you can only want what you know exists. So in this sense, we work. Our work spans scales from the urban prototypes to the urban strategies. We connect both aspects. You could also see it as connecting the body to the planet, or connecting the local to the systemic. And we see that really as a kind of fractal approach. You know, the local and the systemic both are interlinked, and there is a sort of reciprocal causality. So the small aspect, in this case, the small urban prototype has the potential to influence what's happening on the larger scale, but what's happening on the larger scale also influences what's happening on the very local scale. This is just a number of urban prototypes that we have projected and that we have realized in the past. I'm going to show just two of them. The first one, Between the Waters, the Emscher Community Garden. This was a project, an art project in 2010 and 2013, commissioned by Florian Matzner in Germany in the Ruhr region. Which has a long history of industrialization, a lot of coal extraction. And we see here the Emscher River and the Rhein-Herne-Canal. The Emscher River is extremely polluted up to today. It's in a state of renaturalization. And we got asked as a sort of carte blanche, and that's why this commissioning aspect is very important, to be one of 20 artists, and together with Majetica Portric, we thought what to do in this situation, and we got inspired by an island that is between the two waters, and we thought we want to connect the two waters with a natural sewage treatment station that is extremely slim. It is only 80-meter long and 5-meter wide. And it is using only the resources that are available on site. So we have here some toilets, we have a septic tank, we have a natural plant filtration to treat the dirty water from the Emscher River, but also from the toilets. We have then a rainwater collection roof. We have a storage tank, and we have a garden, and in the end we filter this water to make it drinkable with an active carbon filter. When the whole thing got built, of course, we got a lot of opposition before we could realize this project. You see it's looking slightly differently, but even more exciting. It's now transformed into a very long cantilever with a floating toilet. And in fact, it reads almost like a build diagram where all the aspects are exposed, and we can follow the treatment of water in a process that is normally hidden under the ground. Everything is visible from the toilet itself to the whole water cycle. We see here the so-called halophyte filter, that is plant filtration of sewage. You see it in the beginning and after 100 days, so the plants really love all the nutrients they're getting. Then you see the storage of the water with some cushions, which were an important aspect, which also led to a lot of engagement and interaction. And they were loved so much that in fact, later on, we had to replace them with a more sturdy system. And in the end, we have this active carbon filter to filter the water so that you can actually drink it. Now, what's in fact happening is that, of course, it's almost like you drink, it is not almost, it is, you drink the urine of other people. And this had a very shocking, in fact, a shocking effect on visitors, but it made people think what is happening and what is the power of nature to deal with the metabolism. And we also invited an artist, Henriette Waal from Amsterdam, with a mobile beer brewery to brew beer. Beer is an ancient method to produce clean water. And so this act of treatment and in a sort of wasteland almost, bring a toilet was an incredible act of placemaking that brought people together who automatically discussed issues that we wanted to raise. That is, again, you see the diagram, we're working only with energy from solar panels that we installed, and only with the water, the rainwater, the river water, and the wastewater that is on site in order to irrigate a garden. And And so here I want to introduce for the first time this notion of building planetary capacity and working within planetary boundaries and realizing what it means to work within those boundaries, to work only with the rain that we have. You see that the garden is dry for for maybe half of the garden. And this is because we only had the water that we could collect. And that showed us for the first time, okay, maybe our garden was in fact too big. The second project is the King's Cross Pond Club of Soil and Water, part of the Relay Art program curated by Michael Pinsky and Stephanie Delcroix. Again, a project that we realized together with Mariette Zapotrich. It was part of a large urban redevelopment site in King's Cross with the stream, the Regent's Canal, the Camley Street Natural Park, and the aspect that we have the biggest building site at the time in Europe with with the biggest real estate value. And we got interested in this aspect, how is soil something else than just the real estate value? How is it the resource that supports us together with water? And we introduced a small enclave into this building site. And we wanted to bring about an experimental laboratory in this idea in this sort of concept of the building site as the city in the making. We wanted to bring an idea of a future where we can live with the natural environment within the city without any chemicals. It became the first natural swimming pond in the UK that was publicly accessible. And when you work with nature in this way, again, we see the aspect of the planetary capacity, of building capacity. How much water and how many plants do we need to treat the bacteria that come off our body when we're swimming? And that's around 3 square meters. So with the site that we have available, we were able to offer 163 swimmers per day. An entrance, and here you see the whole thing implemented in the wider building site within Cubitt Park next to Central St. Martin's University and St. Pancras and King's Cross in the background with the ongoing building site around. And what was amazing is that we worked not only with the water plants, but we introduced 80 different species of wild plants at an experiment that are normally not chosen to grow within the city or to grow in this particular more or less groomed environment. And through this working with nature up until the aspect to integrate it even when it decays and when it starts looking a little bit challenging, like not so fresh, and when normally the developer wanted to cut it, we kept it all through the winter to offer space for different species. And the fact that nature is always changing over the 16 months of its running time offered different people an environment to come together and to exchange and eventually form a group. The pond has many layers. It has a wild swimming layer, it has a natural layer, it has a cultural layer. And so people came together for different reasons. And after 16 months, they formed a group that when the developer wanted to demolish the project, they came together, they organized a rally. They made a campaign, a petition, and they collected about 5,000 signatures. And they went to Camden Council to hold a plea. And what is interesting in this aspect that I think the moment of enjoyment in the pond was so strong that this group got together and said, we're going to run it. We want to take it over. We want to take the responsibility financially to run the pond and take it to the next step and further. But sadly, because it turned out it is a private development, Camden Council didn't have any rights to interfere. The pond had to be demolished. Around 2,000 people left their well wishes on the petition side, and around 350 of those used the word love. It was the third most mentioned word after pond and swimming, and we found that very remarkable that a space in the city is able to create such a strong relationship with people. Next, I want to show a couple of projects, 3 projects that Paola mentioned already, that now investigate how can we take the learnings from these urban prototypes and how can we use architecture as a systemic tool to explore our relationship with the natural world and to change and integrate all aspects, also financial aspects, also aspects of value building and of practical aspects such as maintenance, etc. So we have a number of projects. I'm going to start with Aqua Carioca in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. When we started this project, in fact, we met a couple of people in the municipality in Rio, and we showed them some projects we had done before, and they invited us to apply our knowledge to the city of Rio that was in urgent need of some solutions, especially for the water pollution aspect. We talked with many people, had many interviews, and simply started listening. This became then a film, the Aqua Carioca Diarios, that you can still watch online. And we brought many people together that normally don't talk together. You see here the forest, the Mata di Atlantica in Rio de Janeiro, and that is where the Rio Carioca has its source. It is pristine and it is pure, and 5 kilometers later it looks like this. And so that is called the lingua negra, the black tongue. It is also in the more southern part of the city, we have so-called emisarios submarinos that bring out the sewage of the city around 5 kilometers further into the sea, and that the sea in the idea that the sea can take care of it. And so we have around 20,000 liters of sewage per second that enters the Guanabara Bay untreated. Normally this is dealt with sewage treatment stations that are outside the city. Nobody wants to live to them, next to them. They are smelly. And we are comparing this to a sort of outside organs, outside the body experience. Which is not only, of course, related to water, also energy, our food, everything is generated outside the city. It is mostly invisible, and we have lost the connection of how to interact with it because it is so invisible. So the question is, what are possibilities to integrate it again systemically into one body that is the urban body? So how can we switch from a city that depends on its relationship with the hinterlands to a fractal, expandable city that incorporates nature and solves problems locally? We start again here with this aspect of water, with how can we integrate plants and all the amazing bacteria and microorganisms that are under the ground and that are fed by the oxygen that is produced by halophyte plants. How can we integrate that in the cycle of the city, and especially in the parts of the city that are more vulnerable and that are more suffering from the pollution? We worked in a gradual upscaling, so from one building to a community of houses that receive water from the forest that then the water, each of the houses could get such a septic tank that you saw before in the first project, how they can share one constructed wetland, and how they can eventually keep their river clean. So this is a system that can be multiplied and can be upscaled by this multiplication to contribute to a clean environment that is more, that offers more livability and a lot more other benefits, such as healthy city. So we work from scales from very small, from a school, 250 houses, 600 houses, 20,000 houses, to 4 million, the whole Guanabara Bay. We chose the different prototypes that we are making related to the position in the city. 2 are related in the flatlands, in Maré, in Rio das Pedras. 2 are related on the mountains. And we then developed from the diagrams that you just saw, we developed a design. How can this systematically be integrated? And you see already the correlation to a kidney or to a lung, where these aspects are integrated within the favela without changing it, using the areas that are normally filled with garbage to make the favela more resilient. They also act like sponges, so also water slides will be less prevalent. This is the integration in the favela Moda Formiga, where you really see very beautifully this connection to the lung, and how we can solve the problem on the spot rather than outsourcing it to other parts of the city, and how we could improve the livability and create communal living around these normally purely infrastructural functions. So what we're doing is actually using the water tank, the septic tank, and the constructed wetland that are purely functional normally. We design with them, and we create a public space around which then many other spin-offs can happen, such as garbage collection, solar energy, and food production. We worked with communities, mostly also with children. This was part of the Sao Paulo Biennial in 2017, where we worked in a neighborhood in Sapé with a biologist and with a graffiti artist to create a graffiti in the neighborhood and exchange with the children on how their neighborhood could improve. What we learned here, that this aspect of map making is a very empowering aspect, and that local, how should I say, local cornerstones, such as this car wash, once they appear on a map within the neighborhood, people feel really empowered, because normally it is only high culture. It is only like museums, mairies. It's only these aspects which are worth putting on a map. And once they see their school, and they see their kindergarten, and they see the lava chateau, then it's like it's becoming more of their space, and they feel more responsible to change it into a better way. We also see that it is possible in this way of communicating within the space where people live without taking away something, rather than bringing something there and leaving it there, such as this graffiti, for instance, to start making a collaborative design, to step by step initiate a project, make a collective effort, and then eventually also come up with a local management and multiplication plan. We then got invited by Studio X in Rio de Janeiro, Pedro Rivera, to collaborate with the Sítio Roberto Bolle Marx, which was one of the most important landscapes architects in Brazil, or worldwide, we should say. I'm sure Ana Paula would agree with me. we got invited to make a prototype of the system. You see here the septic tank, you see the constructed wetland, the water collection tank, and the toilet. And you see another aspect that is part of the struggles when you realize something in person, that you see how important it is to the aspect of monitoring, of checking, which is often forgotten in public projects. Even in big projects, the aspect of monitoring is something that is often taken too lightweight, and often, so here in this case, the fossa septica, the septic tank had a leak. Fortunately, we made a test with clean water before we started using it, and we could repair it. Secondly, the aspect of communication stays important. We took great care to tell the story with drawings and text, to make it again into like a 3D diagram that people can smell, that people can talk about, talk with each other. We also got invited to show the different projects that we made on the different scales, together with some models in the Sitio Roberto Wolle-Marx and in the Studio X. And yeah, and then we actually won the Lafarge-Holcim Bronze Prize for this project that was entirely self-initiated. And so that helped us a lot to then, for the next project, the City of 1,000 Tanks, to win a tender to become the team lead for Water as Leverage for Resilient Cities Asia in Chennai. The Dutch government started a program of knowledge generation and knowledge exchange between Dutch parties and local teams in 3 different cities in the Asian region: in Chennai in India, in Semarang, Indonesia, and in Khulna in Bangladesh. The project was spearheaded by Henk Ovink, and here you see the 2 teams from Chennai. This is the Indian subcontinent with most of the rivers actually flowing into the Bay of Bengal. They heat up during this long journey across the land, and this leads to a rain pattern that has very strong monsoons for 2 months in the year. People suffer from the floods, but in summer, it is mostly dry. So in 2015, we had one of the strongest floods in Chennai where people died. In 2019, we had one of the driest summers. It was day 0 in Chennai, and water had to be brought in with trains. The third aspect is the water pollution. Mostly vulnerable population in slums are blamed, although they only contribute to 0.3% of the pollution. And how come the city is so vulnerable? In this case, it has almost nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with the extremely rapid expansion and the fact that lakes that used to collect the water during the monsoons are simply built upon. 2/3 of Chennai is sealed. Water cannot be absorbed anymore. Ancient tanks were built to absorb the water. There were actually structures created where it was functional, and the community formed around them. The climate prognostic will exacerbate this situation of water scarcity and floods, because temperature is increasing, rainfall is decreasing, but rainfall intensity becomes stronger, and sea levels are rising, which leads to salinity coming into the city. Water also has an effect on climate change in the way that there are strong, very strong carbon emissions from water sourcing with water tankers, drinking water production with desaltification, and methane from exposed sewage. Now, the default answer to these problems are desalination plants and stormwater drains, which are built all across India. Chennai is no difference here. In this way, the precious water is led through the stormwater drains as fast as possible outside the city to be kind of lost forever. And desalination plants need a lot of energy to produce drinking water. They leave brine behind, which endangers the life of fishermen. So for us, this was really the problematic, the starting point. How can we connect? How can we change from a system of scarcity that depends on very far away resource collection of water and leaves the aquifer polluted and diminished? How can we reduce this consumption by 50% with nature-based solutions that are integrated in the city? So how can we move on from a linear city that depends on its hinterland and leaves the waste outside to a city that is in fact a paradigm shift that solves the water problem within its own boundaries and therefore becomes a sort of metaphor for working within the planetary boundaries. So we work with solutions in plants, solutions in soil. In Chennai, we have clay, and below the clay is the sand. So once you penetrate the clay with a built structure, the water can infiltrate. The religious tanks work, in fact, like inverted pyramids. So when it rains, the tank fills up, it slowly releases the water into the first aquifer from where it gets pumped up and used. And just before the monsoon, it would be dry, so it could be desilted with some maintenance. And so now the question is, how do we systematically work with this knowledge? How do we integrate nature-based solutions that are most ideal in forest and national wetland reserves? How can we use them as green roofs, open space, water collection, even from roads? How can we treat the water with bioswales and constructed wetlands? And how can we, in fact, create the city of 1,000 tanks? How can we revive historic tanks, renaturalize rivers, and create new tanks within the city? So here that shows very well the systemic aspect of starting from specific targets, connecting it to 8 different measures. So what we can add here is solid waste recycling and adaptive buildings. Then to integrate these different measures into 4 different watersheds, which then form eventually the city of 1,000 tanks. So one project in the city of Mylapore, that is the first watershed. That's a very historic part with a lot of heritage, with a lot of temple tanks. So we worked out here how we could regreen the city, how we could renaturalize Buckingham Canal and add to the absorption capacity that is at the moment greatly limited, so that we could collect, treat, recharge the water assets to make them ready for consumption locally. Here you see how that would look during the dry season and during the wet season, when the tank, in fact, becomes a barometer of the water level in the city, in the area. We also looked at how this contributes to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we have the water, the goal number 6, but also we have improved biodiversity, we have an improved urban environment and better health and sanitation. We then looked for each of the watersheds and the solutions for the replicability potential. And we looked at how many beneficiaries would each of these projects have, how much water, MLD, in this case, 50 million liters per day. That's a figure that is typically used in India for water generation. That is part of a social housing development, economically weaker section that is suffering greatly from frequent floods. It's the lowest in this watershed. It rains and immediately the water is 1 foot high. So here we introduce new detention tanks that are playgrounds and that can then fill with water. So as I mentioned before, you see again the 4 different watersheds. So one is a temple tank heritage program, one is an adaptive public housing program, one is a green industries program, and one is a smart waterways program. So they deal also with different programs in the city, and they have different ownership and operation models. One model that stands for the other ones is that within this program we worked, we got acquainted, I should say, with international financial institutions such as the Green Climate Funds that loan money to the Tamil Nadu government that then can implement nature-based solutions on public properties that then will lead to increased water assets. The same could be done with local financing for private properties. And once, of course, this is running, you must ask yourself, so what will keep, who is interested in maintaining these nature-based solutions? So the Metro Water would contract local nature-based solutions operators that will maintain and clean these systems. That will then increase to the water sales. So here we have a finance flowing back, and that will eventually also increase the tax revenue with which the Tamil Nadu government could pay back the loans. On a private property, that could function equivalent to, for instance, solar electricity, like where you could have remote water meters that could measure how much water is fed into the system. Now, flow of water means also flow of money. Now this, I don't want to explain it too much in detail, but what is interesting that in the current system where the urban demand relies on desalination and lets the rainfall completely pass the city, which eventually leads to more and more groundwater deficit, with the proposed water balance model where we use not 100%, but a certain percentage of the rainfall, we rely less on desalination. We clean 100% of the generated water 100% of the time. So not only 2 months per year, but 12 months per year with nature-based solutions. We can create this groundwater surplus that then comes in handy in times of drought. We looked at citywide benefits for property development, enabling business. So will people become sick? Will their productivity suffer? How many water savings would the city be able to do? We worked out, based on many assumptions, a total benefits of close to $1 billion per year if this system would be implemented on the whole city. Also we compared the carbon emissions of the business as usual with the water balance model. Then we looked at policy alignment. So how can we align the Paris Agreement with the national plans with the Tamil Nadu State Action Plan and integrate that for the Greater Chennai Corporation? So this is an aspect that is very interesting because it kind of also follows the flow of funding when funding is released, for instance, from the Green Climate Funds. And we worked as well in a more top-down way in many meetings, bilateral meetings with the Tamil Nadu government and the city of Chennai, as well as the banks. So here, this is just some interesting meetings with the banks in Singapore, where for the first time I would say, all of the designers, of the urban designers involved, got confronted with the reality of banks, which is that if you don't show an Excel sheet in your presentation, they simply get lost. They don't know what to do. Like only with images doesn't spin off their imagination. On the other hand, we engaged residents and beneficiaries early on with street campaigns. To select the 4 watersheds that you saw, we devised a game, Money on the Table, where we discussed with different communities, if they had the money, where would they put it and why, on which flagship project. So I think we had about 12 pre-selected. And then we did participative work within the communities. We asked communities with our local partners how they would define their own vulnerability. And we found out that 60% of their vulnerability is related to water, to unhealthy environment, to floods, to the availability of water and sanitation. They have no toilets in their homes. We discussed with street vendors how they could be involved in maintenance aspect. And to work with, we asked women, or we monitored how much time women actually spend in Chitranagar, one of the housing developments. So they spend 4 hours per day in very early morning hours and very late in the night to source water for their family, carry it home. So if each of these 2,500 women would only earn $1 per hour, they would generate a productivity of almost $4 million per year, which is equivalent to 40% of the investment that would be needed to supply them with a good system within their community, having toilets and running water at home. Right now, we work with Vanessa, Nandini, and Shailesh here, locals who train child educators to train then in turn children to become water ambassadors. So we work with children in vulnerable communities and homeless centers. The stunning part was then when we showed them our drawings and we worked with them, they actually reacted much better than adults. They said, this is what we always tried to tell you, that we need to collect rainwater. Children got skills in drawing and making models, singing, performance to express themselves, and then came up with the idea of water rallies through their communities to teach their parents, to make models. We now use part of their ideas in a social media campaign. So this was, for instance, a mascot that is based on the vessel where they collect water and bring it home. And this social media campaign, we work with Instagram, with WhatsApp, with LinkedIn. We make different animations to communicate such aspects as collaboration on watersheds, the benefits, the workings of nature-based solutions underground to a very broad public in Chennai. So these are also online now. And we right now, which is extremely complicated in a COVID situation where we're not able to go to Chennai, we're realizing a water balance pilot, which is in the Little Flower Convent, a school for visually and hearing impaired girls. It's a school for 600 girls in Chennai, where we realized in Chennai for the first time this water balance model with the idea to build capacity with local bureaucrats to then be able to upscale it from field trials such as this one to make a proper feasibility to realize the flagship projects that could perhaps become pioneers and eventually a city norm. So from a process where we start with a pre-feasibility to scale up, we call it the project program approach. So each of those findings feeds into the program of the City of 1,000 Tanks and will evolve that over time. So that there comes this reciprocal causality. So I think I have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to show you how a way of working like this could be applied to the LEAP, the Local Energy Action Plan. That is something that we realized in Rotterdam. It was a research by design commission of the International Architecture Biennial in Rotterdam. So how do we make the leap from where we are now with a carbon footprint of almost 16 tons per person to a zero carbon living and a zero carbon neighborhood, with the goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. That is the goal we got. Erik Swanfjell was already mentioning it. The dream of the carbon neutral city is a dream. It cannot be realized. Now we started from the fact, yeah, what is it in fact? Because we knew we had to communicate to people. So we wanted to drill down these 16 tons, 15.8 tons of carbon emissions. How much is energy actually part of this? And we realized the so-called energy transition, so this is getting off the gas for domestic energy consumption, is only 18% of the total bill. Around 1/4 of our carbon footprint is related to food, 1/4 is related to mobility, 1/4 is related to consumption, and 10% is related to waste. We also compared how that fares on a broader picture compared with other nations. What is the difference between emissions and the footprint, where the emissions are something that in Western nations is always much lower than the footprint compared to more Eastern nations or in the global South that produce goods for the global North, that therefore have a smaller footprint compared to bigger emissions. Within the Paris Agreement, every nation is only responsible for their own emissions. And we tried to make this complex interrelationship then visible for the exhibition in different panels. So how does the personal relate to the global, and how does the neighborhood actually sit in between and becomes the lever where we can act and where we can interfere, where we can connect to the other aspects of the carbon footprint. So how can we also use the investment that comes with the energy transition to tackle the other aspects in a positive way? We looked at it in connecting and integrating 3 different aspects. So we have the more technical aspects that is clearly related to energy, to climate mitigation. We have the aspect that's related to climate adaptation, that is green-blue infrastructure. With those 2 type of instruments, we are creating new assets in the community, and these assets can be run with different governance tools. So that was another panel that shows all the different possibilities. I will just highlight a few that are related to, I think that was an aspect that also came up previously, the aspect of commons. How can we actually run this new type of energy systems that are decentralized, implemented in the neighborhood, such as, for instance, storing the heat in the ground, of course, creating energy with different type of solar panels, food production. How can we own this locally? For instance, we could start with a project group that runs low-risk interventions, such as, for instance, facade gardens. Then we can have a proper corporation, an energy service company that is co-owned by renters. So a renter can be an owner as well for the time he's renting. 2 other possibilities, such as a normal company for people who just want somebody to run it, but still don't want the profit to go to companies that, for instance, are owned by shareholders and are having to create huge profits that then go abroad. For the exhibition, we realized these tools in sort of little pieces of paper that people could take home and connected them in a game-like way with the governance tools so that it becomes more tangible. We also created scenarios with these tools. So these are visions that clearly take into account that this is not something that will happen, but something that might happen if you put together certain tools together in a different way. So what we see here, we see different aquathermal storage in the ground too. We see some aquathermal energy. All this is connected with an energy hub that replaces one of the garages. We see then how the neighborhood changes from offering many parking places to reduce that, to offer local food production. And we calculated the benefits that this would give the city. So you have the very strict technical benefits. With so much investment, you create so much reduction of the carbon footprint. And then you have the more the benefits related to the sustainable development goals, which are of a qualitative manner. What we can say is that from the 18% that is related to energy consumption, we can reduce the carbon footprint by 61%. We can get 100% of the gas, and we can produce all the heat locally. We can reduce the temperature in green urban spaces is 10 degrees Celsius cooler than in hard urban surfaces. It is possible to create local jobs with the energy transition, to create the possibility of engagement, of getting connected and creating a consciousness for the environment and recycling. We can engage people in sustainable energy projects. Right now, in this new edition of the Biennale, we have a curatorial collective. So we have initiatives from the neighborhood, which I should say is the second poorest neighborhood of the Netherlands, but has a lot of amazing initiatives. We work with them together now how we can kick this off. And I think what is interesting also talking about integration is that different investments of different heights are done in the different aspects. So for instance, we have 4.1 billion euros that are invested in the energy transition in the Netherlands per year, compared to 2 billion invested in climate adaptation, compared to 200 invested in health and well-being, which is also jobs, which is also basically people get sick mentally. So how could we leverage some of this investment and introduce it to solve the other problems? This is not easy because it has another time aspect. So we integrate over time, we integrate from different pillars in the municipality that are not necessarily used to work together. So this is the aspect which is not worked out. Further, again, you see the different scales. How does the planet eventually, via different policy tools, relate to the neighborhood itself? And how can we contribute with learnings from the neighborhood to the different policies that connect the Paris Accord to the European climate policy to the national one, etc. For the exhibition, we then brought together knowledge. So we brought together the conceptual aspect of the LEAP with the 4 different scenarios, with a plan that the city has already. So we visualized what is ongoing in the city, together what is ongoing in the neighborhood, what are the different initiatives. So this became an Agora from which we discussed with people together. Unfortunately, we have to say again, in online Zoom sessions, and only now we would be ready, at least we dare to go for walks together through the neighborhood. So let's see where that takes us. This project is still ongoing. And in the last 5 minutes, I want to show the project that was exhibited this year in the Venice Biennial, and that is on site in Sweden, Stockholm. It's an art project for the Albano campus in connecting 3 different universities in Sweden, in Stockholm. And we got part of this project of the campus quite early on. We started in 2015 to think about it. And what we realized, we all know that by now, that climate change seems to be much stronger. Heat anomalies and wildfires are stronger in the further north we go. On the other hand, we saw that to make this university campus, a large amount of granite rock had to be excavated. So we brought the 2 together, and together with Maritza Podrich, again, with whom we always collaborate for the public art projects, we came up with the idea of a future island. So why don't we make in the new park of the Albano University an artificial island from granite rocks, and we heat half of the island to +5 degrees to see how species would adapt to this condition. So it's always 5 degrees hotter than the surrounding temperatures, and we are connecting the geological time, the time of stone, to the time of species. So we see how they evolve together over time. So the island has different layers. You see here that is part of it is a technical challenge. Again, how do we make this happen? The other part, this is our first permanent work. How do we make that happen over the next 100 years? How do we engage in a program with researchers of the university who at first were sort of, I would say, quite negative in the sense that they said, hey, this is not a scientific experiment, you know, then you would need to have 50 of those islands. But rather, how could eventually there is a Stockholm Resilience Center, they also work with communication, and eventually they realized that through this island, they could communicate many of the aspects they are working with within their own buildings. And so it could be actually a relational object in this sense that brings together many different users of this new university campus. So these are some impressions from the site where we worked with these rocks that were kept in storage for 5 years for us, where we started to work with the builders to drill the rocks to receive the heating pipes. We heat the system with a heat pump that is run by solar cells that are on the roof of the university. And for the Venice Biennial, we actually made an installation where we combined a prototype of the future island, a rock that traveled from Sweden to Venice, with a research into the timeline of Earth. Somehow being forced to look 100 years in the future made us curious to look in the past of the history of Earth. So what you see here is a logarithmic timeline that goes back 4.5 billion years. And that maps out and brings different aspects together that happened at the same time. So we can see the medium temperature right now is around 14.5, 15 degrees. We see here roughly 1,000 years ago. You see here that part here. We can also see that Earth in the past has been much hotter than now. The medium temperature went up as much as almost 30 degrees. Earth went through many crises, and interestingly, so that's what these different stories are about. Each crisis brought about new life forms, and somehow each crisis, if we see species as their own architects, led to new life forms that got introduced. Before I finish, I would like to share with you that when you look at this timeline and you see 2.5 million years ago, that's when the temperature fell below the 15 degrees. This is exactly when humans started to develop from the apes. So this is really interesting that dinosaurs, etc., are able to withstand very hot temperatures. Mammals like it colder, and the colder it gets, the more human was thriving. Human was then challenged with very strong up and downs, extreme ice ages. And in this period, Homo sapiens developed, brain size increased threefold. And so these are just some stories. Again, this project has its own website online. If you're interested, you can read all these stories of the history of Earth. 300 years ago, more or less, we were in a period of extreme of a climate that was extremely stable, 20 years of very good agriculture. So that led to investments in industrialization to bring capitalism a step further. So we always see how climate is strongly linked to the development. And in this context, we are placing Future Island to speculate how that temperature might increase depending on our ability to adapt and to adapt with the species together to realize it's the first time, of course, that Earth is in this crisis because of the species themselves. All other crises were coming from outside forces, volcanoes or meteors. And so I want to finish this lecture with looking back on this situation of burnout and how we could flip this pyramid if we would involve nature as a stakeholder and become stewards and custodians of the planet, also with the type of work we're doing. I want to thank all the collaborators of our OOS team for the various projects. And maybe these are different lessons that gives us food for thought to talk about, to discuss in the next hour or so. So one lesson is we need to assess and build up capacity locally. So that is, we need to look what is possible locally, how can we contribute? We need to integrate systems into a holistic whole. So that is systems over time, resource systems, spatial integration. We need then to co-own and operate systems locally to create ownership and responsibility. We need to count down to a deadline that is much closer than 2050 in order to think how we can feel it in the next 5 years. And we need to communicate as much as we possibly can. So thank you, and I'm curious to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Eva, for the lecture and the project. I think I was wrong. I was confusing Chennai with a city in Thailand, but no, it's in India, something different.
Yeah, it's all in India. Yeah.
So, students and public, would you like to react or to bring questions or?
There is one question from Nima here. Nima, if you want to unmute first. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you for your very interesting lecture. My question is about your the first lesson you've talked about right now, access and built-up capacity locally. When you were describing your project, I was thinking that how did you, organize or form a durable communication with locals? Because I was thinking that how did you, convince them after leaving those faraway cities and communities to stay and participate in your ongoing process there? Are you actually guide them from far away from your office in the Netherlands, or you have like some locals there in those cities, or how do you communicate with them after?
Do you want me to answer this for a specific project or more in general?
Whatever you want, because you work in Brazil, in India, and you know, they're, of course, they're different, but what is your solution generally for?
So let's say the important pillar is, of course, the good listening, and as fortunately there in the past have been other times than the situation we in right now, so we could travel. We lived for large periods of time in Brazil where we had friends. So we were really supported by people there to run this, in the beginning, self-initiated research project, which then got more and more supporters. And it is a process, I would say, of like a chain reaction. So you get to know one person, then that person introduces you to someone else, then you go to that community because you know that person, and then you get to know more people. So you kind of follow a network where we were just realizing the other day that in these 4 different communities where we worked in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, each one came about through another friend, through another connection that we had. So there is a sort of wish to do something and to look, but then it's also taking the opportunity that you find and then simply going with it. For Chennai, for instance, we had done a project with the Goethe Institute before we put together the team. That was an art project that was 2 years before that large water as leverage project. So we had some connections, and one of our local partners did an internship and then worked with us for 2 years in Rotterdam. So that became sort of the backbone of how we work with the local team. And we did, before we started our project, our agency in 2003, we did a round the world trip. And that was really the moment where we stayed very long in Brazil and in India and got to know the local cultures, and also decided those are the 2 countries that we would love to work on. And so we have a history of working that goes back longer in India than just this one project, also with other people. So maybe that answers partly this.
But what if you want to go to, sorry to interrupt you, but what if you want to go to a new country that you have not any background with them, especially during the post-COVID days, post-COVID era, which is hardly to travel?
Yeah, it's difficult. I don't really have an answer for that. For instance, what you saw from the research in Rotterdam, we had a lot of interactions with people in the neighborhood before COVID started, and we, for instance, got the feedback on the carbon footprint. We got a really good feedback that people are really hungry for information. They want to engage in their future, etc. But when COVID hit, people had other problems. And only now, as we start to learn to live with COVID and take it as a reality, we then use now other channels, like walks, for instance, that are now in the pipeline for 2022 to somehow accept and we become more local right now. So that is maybe related to the struggles I was mentioning in my introduction. We now trying to build this pilot in Chennai remotely, and it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. It's really a very big struggle to manage. I hope we will this year.
Thank you.
I had a question. Thanks a lot for the presentation first, because I think it was very interesting, as at least as Valentine also mentioned earlier, that at the end of this series to actually see how all of this can come together, the policies, the economy, which is the one thing we've been struggling with a lot, at least in thoughts, because we don't really sort of reach there. But I wanted to ask more in that line of the timeline, especially for example, the project in Chennai, considering the urgency of the project to actually get implemented, because the territory needs it. But also, how do you imagine how long do these projects take before they actually start?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How long do they actually take, and how can we bring about change? To start with the positive note, I heard a young climate activist from the US speak, and he was emphasizing that change is exponential. So that older people think about change as linear. So we do this, then we do this, then we do this. Whereas he emphasized the young generation thinks as change as exponential. So once we saw that happening with the movement that Greta maybe started, and that eventually, suddenly it grows. It's very fast. As for the project in Chennai, we have not reached that moment yet, and that was also the sort of how we saw it step by step. So you saw the first half year. That's when all the, let's say, brain work happened. The concept was developed, we met the banks, we realized the banks are actually not interested in savings because banks need to generate revenue. They're interested to loan money, but to generate savings. Savings actually is a degrowth model if you take it like that. The person who is eventually interested in savings is the end user, for whom otherwise the water bill would go up. So we have to build this into a new type of economic model. At the moment, I would say the biggest obstacle are vested interests with these large scale projects, and also vested interest in the sense that there's many stakeholders who want to keep it working the way they do. And so that is also was the idea behind the social media campaign. So we need to explain people that they can want something else. And what is happening in Chennai was that now actually people are complaining to the municipality if the municipality wants to build stormwater drains. So that is a success that we can book, that changed in the consciousness. The city is now interested in nature-based solutions, whereas in the first, I would say, year, there was a very big resistance. Now we're starting to get them interested. We had a launch. We had lots of press articles 2 months ago. We got a call from the chief secretary of Tamil Nadu. So they're now waiting for this pilot, basically. So I think the pilot is really a crucial aspect to see how it's functioning. And what we realized too, what is mostly forgotten, is the amount of repair and the amount of finance that needs to go into repair of the systems we have, that is totally underestimated. And also any system like this, see, because that is the out of body kind of aspect. So it's very easy to get finance for very large projects that are outside the city, but to create all the networks to actually feed them, mostly they don't exist. So these big stations run under capacity. In Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro it was like that, in Chennai it's like that. So I don't want to generalize, but there is a pattern, let's say.
Mike, I have a question also. Mike, if you want.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if you can hear me. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was great. I have a question, possibly a little bit more technical, but in material flow analysis, as far as I know, energy and water are often not included in material flow analysis calculations. So when cities look at cities, countries, regions, when they all look at how material flows, I find it strange, and especially then on the basis of, in one of your slides, you were showing sort of the 3 points, energy being one, water being the second, and I forget the third, to be honest, right now.
Governance, yeah.
But I'm kind of wondering what you think of the fact that neither of those two elements are are included in material flow analysis models. Or if, I don't know if it's of relevance maybe to your work or not.
Yeah, perhaps that is because architecture is typically seen as building with resources, building with concrete, with glass, with sand, etc. And less infrastructure and flows are less part of it. I think it's that. There could be another reason, that it's very complex. I can say from our own experience that working with water is a lot less complex than working with energy. Because energy is everything, it's in everything, it is everything. Also, ownerships is still much more complex. We have different type of laws that even don't allow a neighborhood, for instance, to generate heat. So it has to be smaller units. So there is concessions given a long time in advance. So this type of flow analysis, to connect it to the material, would totally make sense. I actually wanted to put in a slide, I forgot. We did once a research that looked at oil as a material that is that replenishes itself at a certain speed. So you could say oil is renewable. Any material is in fact also a flow. Even stone takes a long time to make. So that is something we learned from the Venice research, that somehow material and flows over time in history of Earth are not two different things, but are the same thing. And when you look at oil and the speed in which it's produced, you get around, I think it was 2 milliliter per person on Earth per year. That is equivalent to 1 plastic bag that we would all have if we would take the material that we use normally as an energy source, as a renewable resource. So I think it's a matter of addressing it. I think it can be done, but it is complex. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, since we're here, I also have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering, these kind of projects, they're not new. And as you say, I mean, we all have the technology that's been here for hundreds of years, and how do we actually integrate them in our modern cities? So in the end, from your own experience, what is the biggest project that you were able to implement with with this kind of approach, dealing with water? Like, is it maybe Chennai the biggest project, or is it still a work in process, or is it like a neighborhood scale, or what is your
How would you define biggest?
I don't know, I might say area in this case.
Area,
is it a neighborhood scale? Is it a city scale? Is it a region scale? Or like, yeah, how much can you implement?
Okay, so if we talk,
yeah,
if we talk real scale, it is definitely Chennai. So Chennai is 8 million people city. It's growing to 15 million over the next 10 years in the greater Chennai region. So let's say simply the amount of inhabitants, it is clearly this one. Of course, Rio de Janeiro is also very large, but by far we were not as close to realization because we only work by ourselves, whereas now we come with partners with the Dutch government who basically introduces this project at the right position. So that's a much better, a stronger position to be in. And of course, if you think systemic, then scale is something that is not necessarily linked to amount of inhabitants. For instance, the local energy action plan, we are now in talks with the province of South Holland, who is looking to make this exhibition travel to different city halls and different province halls in the Netherlands to share the knowledge that the energy transition can be done in another way too. So, and in that sense, the let's say outreach could be large. We haven't realized it yet, but it is more in it's more maybe of a knowledge project. It doesn't mean we would be necessarily so hands-on involved everywhere. So the hands-on part stays rather small, but then it's also changing, of course. That's with master planning, you let it go. No, at some point you make an example, and then people adapt it in their own way, and it's changing.
Thank you.
Maybe Matteo, you had something to ask, no? If I'm not wrong.
Yeah, you more or less answered. Hello. It was more a question regarding if you work with a government in a European country or in a, let's say, in a more developed country, at least a problem I encountered often when you go to the government or the city, they never want to accept this kind of projects because they already have invested in cleaning machines, in maintenance system for the city. So the question is, what are the arguments you use? Because, I mean, most politicians are elected for 4 years and their main concern is to be re-elected in 4 years. So how do you manage? Because this project, they are, at least in France, Switzerland, they are over at least 15, 25 years. So what are the arguments that you use to make them take this project that will take much longer that their elective course?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because this is, I think, sits at the core of why it didn't happen yet. That somehow the political cycles is not properly connected to ecological cycles and to this very, very long-term thinking that we have to develop. So I don't have a solution. I can only share some experiences of arguments that we are facing. So one important argument is, of course, risk. And that is that, and I think I even in working with the banks, I started to think maybe we should be working with insurance companies, with pension funds who think more long term. That's also something interesting to think in the context of Switzerland. And risk is, let's say, it seemed, at least until now, it seemed less risky to put all your money in a very clear project, top down. Everything is decided. There is no risk that anybody would say something against it, but more and more shareholders demand investments that are equitable, because otherwise their reputation will go downhill. So that is something that we did here, I would say, in the last year, more and more often, that through this reputation, that can become an important leverage to engage in a project that has a good message. The other aspect is trust. And trust you can build up by actually showing that it can work. That, like, for instance, we face, like with energy cooperatives, we need to give examples. There are cities in Germany where energy cooperatives are running. They may be not as holistic as we pictured it here, but cities, smaller cities especially, do experiment with this by themselves because they feel it in their own pockets. So that is something where we feel we, if we talk more directly with citizens, more bottom up, that can also be something that gives us then leverage towards the politicians. I mean, for the LEAP, we even had one politician who called us up and said, can I talk to you that I put it rightly in my election program? That was the first time this happened. I don't know what he will implement, but I found it interesting to communicate with everybody. And another aspect is, of course, that there is so much, we feel, whether this is in Brazil or in India or in Rotterdam, the amount of fake news is something that we can break through with built evidence somehow. And this works all across, because once it's built, it's there, and you simply see if it works. And that's a reason why I feel eventually change can be exponential if we manage to get the foot in the door in this way. But yeah, I guess communication is a very important aspect of the work.
I mean, you wanted to ask?
Yes, hello. It was, thank you for the great presentation and actually seeing these kind of thoughts touching the ground in a way. And I was going to ask something that kind of follows up on the previous question with regards to communication with these different groups and the tools that you felt were successful in employing in discussing with such a broad spectrum of groups, from informal people, from inhabitants of informal areas, to politicians, to banks, for example, the Excel sheet example. And I also wanted to ask if you, from your experience, did you feel potential in these kinds of projects actually being implemented in a faster timeline, for example, in informal areas? Do you feel like comparing the European model to the Indian model, for example?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So to answer the first question first about the communication, I think probably, as you saw in the lecture, we communicate a lot through images, through diagrams that try to show complex relationships through more than just words. And we found that this type of communication, and we know because people told us that the aspect of beauty is very important. Because when you work with communities, especially vulnerable communities, they're very susceptible to be treated with respect and to be presented with a beautiful presentation and beautiful images shows respect to this community, and to take what they have seriously and to work with it, to take it for granted rather than try to demolish it and build a new reality. That is also an important aspect. And somehow it's interesting because many people across different, let's say, fields relate to the same image. You saw that picture of the body, you know, with outside the organs inside. So bankers loved this image. it was very curious, but it was very successful. The same, this octopus with the sort of showing that the city can shrink from the far away. So there is some images that make people realize the interconnectedness of the work which is at stake, and that show the benefits of the work that is at stake. And so in this way, in another lecture, I also got the comment that we don't show any plans. And that is also because generally people don't relate to plans. Plans are very, let's say, cryptic. It's a tool that we use to communicate as urban planners and architects. But a standard person has difficulties to read a plan. And so I think gradually we started to eliminate this from our work. It is there. So for the pilot, we have plenty of plans, but we don't communicate with it as such. And then to your second question, so that's also a very interesting aspect, that in informal communities, also same in Brazil, in Chennai, in Rotterdam, which is less, we cannot call it a slum, it's just an economically weaker neighborhood. People are much more hands-on. They have another sense of time. So for them, it's like, okay, you want to do this? Let's start tomorrow. Let's start now. You know, you can start in front of my house, and then you're like, okay, but I'm not ready. Like, so, and people know how to build. So that is a great advantage through, for instance, through the Water Ambassadors program with the children. Children told their parents to fix their dripping water pipes at home. So then actually parents climb up the rainwater pipes and start to do something about it because the children force them to do that. In Brazil also, we had communities that were ready. We were about to start a pilot in a school together with the Museu do Amanhã, and then the whole government changed and Brazil fell into dark ages politically. So that is also, let's say, you kind of dependent on these cycles. And when you work locally, you're less dependent on them. You depend on people know that rainwater connection would help them because they need to pay less, simply. That's what it comes down to, yeah.
At this point of the session, I used to ask for online question, but now it seems that every question has been raised. So
I think we have to thank we have to thank the students also for being still so lively in this evening of charrette, concluding the semester. So thanks so much for being there and active. And of course, thanks to Eva, because it has been so nice to motivate them to open to this discussion. Maybe I have a couple of questions, Eva, for you. Say, on one side, I am sometimes a little bit surprised by the discrepancy between the dimension, the size, the scale of the problems, and the scale of solution. Now, they seem sometimes very, very small, and without asking so much effort. Of course, I understand very well the idea of the diffuse project where you can do with small things, but that you can have for a spread. We know that this is a strength, but at the same time is also a weakness, because these very diffuse actions that are for sure probably the best we can imagine today are also in reality the most difficult. And some of the questions of the students about how you can last in time when you have such scattered situation. Maybe some reaction from your side on this discrepancy, in the sense that we want to get out of a system and we want to bring a different perspective, but which is, I use a term that the students will understand, that it is fundamentally weak. Now, you have nothing that can really make a kind of resistance to and guarantee you that you will get to the moment. And that's for me something that is still not solved, not by you, but in general. I think that also in projects we are working on is always a very difficult point. And my second question is about art. So you are working with artists, and you probably are also a little bit artist. At least you have this kind of poetic also component. How do you see, I mean, how do you see the role of art? I see very well, of course, in the sense of opening up imagination and bringing kind of demonstrators, now that can really give you the intention, the idea to, etc. What more? What do you think art can bring more than this? And maybe how?
So, yeah, okay, I'm gonna note this down. So to first come to your first question, Paola, that's a very, very important, it's a fundamental question, I would say. And in the banking jargon, I think they would have called it granulated approach, which is somehow many small things form eventually a unity. And why I believe in this, despite all the difficulties, is for some reason. One, I think we have better and better digital and remote tools to be able, there must be one element of centralization. So if you have many decentralized things, there must be at some point an element of centralization. So this element of centralization can also be an aspect of remote monitoring, for instance, water levels, energy levels. We are with digital tools, we are much better to collaborate as a group, even with people we don't know. And so I think from this point of perspective, I see many possibilities that we have not yet fully understood or engaged with in working with these smaller systems to make them functional into a bigger system to work together. Conceptually, I believe it is, at least it might not be the solution in every situation, in every urban situation, but I believe it's very, it's somehow how nature functions, that there is not one big solution, but many small solutions. So this is something, that I believe it's intrinsic, and it's something related to understanding processes, understanding how Earth systems work, that we engage in a process rather than just a thing that we are building. So in this sense, I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying, but and the third aspect maybe, that I believe we have so many surfaces within cities that are built, and we're encroaching more and more natural systems that help us to deal with the situation we are in, that we have to see how we can influence the Earth system capacity in a positive way with the surfaces that we have already built. So how can we double use the surfaces in the city that we have already, rather than changing a forest or a field, or a field that could be used for agriculture into a solar farm? Why don't we do that in the city and try to connect it? So from an urgency point of view, where we need to be, because we have a limited carbon budget, I think we need to start from where we can be and work it out locally of what that would mean. And so that connecting to that is the reason that I believe if we would see more in our environment what it would do, we would be more ready to change. We would be more ready to change our behavior because we could live with it. We could talk about it. If it's always something that's happening in the North Sea or in the Alps or in the desert, it's too far away and we don't have any relationship. So I think there is, of course, you think, these systems exist since many years, but successfully it hasn't worked in this way together, although there are some cities in Sweden or in the US that work with nature-based solutions for their sewage system, for instance. So there are examples. There are also examples for energy, and maybe that's where the art aspect is interesting, that it comes in. I think working as an artist, with an artist, we found it very liberating to be able to see a situation without an ask and to develop the ask as we are working. So to look at the context in all its aspect and to look at history, what has happened in this place and what would make sense to embed in this process that we find here. So to have a carte blanche is very liberating, to think in dimensions that maybe artists are more avant-garde than other people. They feel things rather than rationalize. And now, for instance, 10 years later, I see aspects in the projects we did that when we did it, we just did it. We didn't necessarily rationalize so much about it. So, and of course, there is this nice aspect that you do something, you build it, and you get feedback from people that interact with it, and it's part of a festival or a cultural intervention. And so that is where I believe architecture is very close to art anyhow, as a cultural discipline. And I believe that culture is totally underestimated in what it can do for this change and this transition we have to go through. Like we know that since 1 million years, we use fire on a daily basis. We just like burn things all the time. And meanwhile, we have ecosystems, plants, etc., which work with solar energy in a different way. So how could we change this culture? How could we smarten up in this aspect from what we are used to do to what we maybe should do? So for me, that's a cultural question more than a technical question, actually. And that's where I feel we should engage in it and we should benefit. So I find in infrastructure, there's a lot of money actually available. And if we would manage to take some of this and reintroduce it into the cultural sector, that could greatly benefit. So to show these links, how the two link is really worthwhile, I think, for the profession.
Thank you very much, Eva. I think this idea of liberating ourselves is important. Okay, Valentin, if there are no other questions, we can in fact liberate Eva from from this burden. Eva, thank you very much. I hope that we will have other occasion to invite you and continue our conversation. And thanks again to the students for being here, even tonight, in the mid of this COVID epidemic that we also were a little bit suffering in the studio. So
yeah, I can.
Yeah. Thanks a lot to everyone, and see you very soon. And Happy New Year, Eva. I think we will not.
And thank you again for the invitation. I found the questions extremely interesting. So I'm really sorry we cannot go for drinks somewhere.
Yeah, that's really a pity.
And I hope to see you sometime in person. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And
we will have the pleasure to continue the cycle of session on the spring semester from ETH.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye. Bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao, obrigada.
Ciao. Ciao. Okay.